everybody. I'm Meg Carpenter at Ficomm, and I am pumped to be here with my good friend, Mark Bruno, who is the managing director, oversees all of wealth management for Informa. And what we're excited to sort of bring to you today is just a really organic conversation around the topic of industry events. So we'll dive in more to that. But Mark, first of all, just like, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's fun being on the other end of the mic or the Zoom for a change. So I'm very much looking forward to this.
Cool. So for everybody listening, Mark and I both sort of work with clients in a similar capacity, but from two really different perspectives as it comes to events, industry events. So, and Mark, you know this about Ficomm, we work with a lot of our clients on their overarching event strategy. So how does the strategy relate to their broader marketing strategy? How does that support business goals and objectives? But sort of like once we sort of know what the strategy should be, how do we make selections for where should our clients show up? How much should they spend? Should they get a booth? Should they just show up? Should we pitch them to speak? Like all of the things. So we do that regularly as part of our ongoing work with our clients here at Ficomm. You work with our clients, but just from the perspective of the media. So obviously we know that wealth management hosts a lot of incredible events throughout the year. I love Wealth Management Edge, which we're recording this in April. That's coming up in May. It brings together Wealth Stack, RIA Edge, Inside ETFs. So like tell the audience just quickly, like how do you work with clients from an event perspective?
Sure. So the way we're structured, I started about 2 years ago, actually almost to the day that we're recording this at Informa. And we had separate businesses, our event business and our media business, wealthmanagement.com, were really siloed and not connected. But there's a huge opportunity, or was a huge opportunity for us to really bring those businesses together and create, communities. I've said it a lot internally. I think it's probably the first time I'll say it externally, but I don't want to think of us as a media business or an event business. We're an audience and a content business, right? So for me, when I look at Wealth Management Edge, I was involved in really being the architect behind the strategy of it. And now that, we've built the team out, it's more established, it's become a really vibrant event and hopefully one that stands out in a pretty crowded industry now. I'm heavily involved in making sure that we have the right people, the right companies, and the right topics. There are so many things that you could focus on and so many different ways that you could define success when you're producing an event. But more than anything, if you really want to differentiate, you have to figure out what problem am I solving in the marketplace? What is my unique value proposition? And for me, that all starts with community.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's one of like the great benefits. So we'll get to benefits of events. The reason that we wanted to have this conversation though is because Mark, like you and I are out in the industry. We're talking to a lot of executives. We're helping these executives think through like all of the opportunities to fulfill their business goals for the year, events being one of those. And coming through COVID, everyone sort of thought, gosh, like events went from being like pretty present in the industry to overnight just ending. And I know there was a lot of talk coming out of the pandemic of like, what's going to happen to events? Are they going to come back? Are they going to be mostly virtual? Like, what is that going to look and feel like? And my experience has been that events have come back with like fervor, like there's the pace and the value and the frequency and like all the things of events today is like at this like amazing peak. But the question is like, and that's what we want to talk about today, like, are events really worth it? Like as an executive, when you are looking at your overall strategy, and then you're looking at the budget that's supposed to fulfill that strategy, events can oftentimes, for some businesses across the wealth management space, be a very significant line item, 6 figures, 7 figures. And so like, what we want to talk about today is, are events really worth it? Yeah. So I think I'll start, like my first question for you in this conversation is like, if I am one of your clients and you're talking to me about we'll just use Wealth Management Edge as an example. And I'm saying, gosh, Mark, it's hard for me to tell because I never really know. Like we always go to events and it's always part of our budget. And I never really know what I'm going to get out of it. Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's the most important question you should be asking, right? No one is obligated to go to events, although it may feel like that at times, right? Typically, if it's a company that I've known for quite some time and they're interested in the event, And let's just say it's a company that has not really done much in the event space, right? They're experimenting, they're trying to figure out, where they should dip their toe in. The question I'll always ask is, what are you trying to accomplish, right, at that event? And ultimately, what are you trying to accomplish from a business perspective? Because it may not be, a face-to-face experience. I think there are definitely a lot of questions that you have to ask yourself as a business leader. If you want to answer, are events worth it? By and large, I think they can be, right? It's not just about what am I spending? Am I getting a clear ROI? I think a clear ROI, excuse me. It's really, do I have a plan, right, in place for when I'm leading into the event, the 3, 4, 5 weeks leading up? What am I doing to sort of leverage our presence and really think about how we can activate some of our messaging, get meetings, participate in a way that's meaningful? And then when we're there, right, what's our objective? Is it to get as many business cards or LinkedIn connections as possible, or are you actually looking to do business and deals while you're there, right? So basically, that framework is where I would start with any client that came to me and said, Mark, should we be participating in Wealth Management Edge? I think the other part of it is making sure that the content is the right fit, right? There are so many events in our space that even if you don't have a speaking spot and you're not on the agenda, right, you do need to look at what is this conference really about, right? There are always networking opportunities at any conference, right? But if you think about, the agenda is really the North Star, right? That's what leads an individual financial advisor to determine, is this for me, right? I think sponsors ask the question, would this event be worth it, right? I think advisors are asking that question, but they're also asking, like, is this really specifically speaking to the type of business I run, the type of clients I work with, and the types of problems that I'm trying to solve for within my business, right? So, I think there are so many different questions that you could ask, but having a framework in place to figure out, one, how am I going to take advantage of this opportunity and how does it align with my objectives? And then two, is this the right place at the right time for me? There are definitely companies that like to sort of plan press releases or other announcements around the timing of a big event, right? So if you do have something like that, that might be just one example of, like, all right, maybe this is the right platform or the right opportunity to make a splash. So there's digital activation, but there's the in-person activation that you can get in front of a couple hundred or even a couple thousand financial advisors.
Yeah, I love that you have the framework concept. I'm going to do like a quick pause and hit show self view because I'm recording this, and I just got a note that if I don't show my self view, then my video won't feed. So we're just going to keep rolling with it. And if you're watching this and didn't see my video for the first 5 minutes, rookie mistake, but we just fixed it. So I love that you're talking about frameworks, because we start in the same way with our clients. Like, we start thinking about business goals and objectives, why are you doing what you're doing? And also, who are you doing it for? Which sort of speaks to your content. Like, is the content relevant, right? And then out of that needs to come specific, sort of like specific goals that then you decide, okay, which marketing lever am I going to pull for each of these goals? And so when we're thinking through events with our clients, it's really along the lines of, like, which goal would tie specifically to an outcome that you could achieve at an event. And the outcome that I think most executives want to speak to is like some type of direct return on an investment. So number of, new advisor prospects that are going to come into the pipeline, or like how, filling top of funnel, or net new assets that might be there, like roaming around the exhibit hall. And we really coach our clients, and I would love your take on this too, to think about it from a different perspective, which is if one of your objectives is brand building, or if one of your objectives is around educating the market, or perhaps you have an objective around building advisor community. Those are the types of objectives that, to me, I would say, yes, 10 out of 10 times, if you're looking to build brand awareness, credibility, right? Recognition. If you're looking to educate the market, maybe you have a topic that you're really passionate about that you feel like the industry is just missing, or at least they're missing your perspective, and like the more urgency and passion you have around that, the better. Or if you're trying to build community, whether it's community with current clients, prospective clients, or across the industry, then like that, to me, is why I would encourage you to show up at an event. what else would you say, like when you're speaking to someone, what outcomes do you think are directly tied to events?
So I think there are a few different things. There's definitely, when you look at the thought leadership and you look at the potential for speaking roles, I would kind of put that in one lane, right? It's one thing if you're in a digital or a media environment, if you're authoring an article or you're being interviewed in a podcast. But that to me is more top of the funnel marketing, right? If you really want to go to that next level, right, and you want more consideration for whatever it is that you're trying to establish, whether it's from a brand perspective or if you're a CEO and you're trying to raise your own profile, the face-to-face really does present you with that opportunity to get close to your clients and close to potential clients, right? And I've said this so many times before, but I've always felt that, and I didn't like events when I first started doing this a really long time ago. And maybe it was because we didn't actually have an event team and we were all just in it, right? We were, front of the house, we were bussing tables, we were waiting table, all of it, right? But fast forward 15, 20 years, and I actually really love events because I think it represents the best opportunity to personalize your business, period, right? In our space. There's so much noise on social, there's so much digital media, right? And it doesn't mean that there isn't quality content on all of those different platforms and channels. But there's something about being able to have a focused one-to-one conversation, whether it's 3 minutes or it's 30 minutes long, right? And then to be able to stack that or roll that out over the course of 2 or 3 days, right? You could legitimately leave a conference doing a month's worth of meetings in 2 or 3 days, right? So if I'm, to answer your question, just sort of thinking about what do I want to accomplish, how can I get my brand out there? What problem does an event solve for me? If I don't have a presence, right, or I don't have a voice in a conversation that I want to, then find a way to do it right on the agenda. If I then want to go next level and start getting consideration and having real meaningful conversations, why am I on a stage talking about, right, this MarTech platform that I've built out? Not just because I want to make a lot of money, right, but because I understand who you are as an advisor. I understand the size of the prize. And I think I have something that at maximum, it's cracked the code. At minimum, it will help you grow your business, right? You have to be able to have that conversation where you can do a little show and tell together, right? And then the best case scenario, of course, is at the event conversion, right? Is the last piece of the puzzle. You've landed new clients. And if you didn't in that moment, that's okay, right? But you do have to have a clear follow-up, right? For how you're going to take advantage of everything that has taken place during that 2, 3, 4 day period. But it's not an easy thing to figure out, but you have to have the right mindset and the right framework.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that follow-up plan is really critical. We've all been to so many events before where you come back with a stack of business cards or like notes in your phone and you're like, who is that? What did I talk to them about? So yeah, I think the follow-up is really important. I think you touched on another point, which I'm totally in alignment with, which is like the efficiency of events. And this is a relationship business, and you and I recorded a podcast last week for wealth management where we talked about how it's a relationship business. It's in a really amazing like growth industry, right? We have more people across the country who are seeking qualified financial advice and there are advisors to serve them. And with that growth industry brings growth opportunities for the vendors that serve the advisors. And so when you think about it, all of those things, growth, relationships, and you think like we're all across the country, the people that we work with, sometimes, there's people around the world that we're working with. And so for me, I can't physically be in front of all of our clients all the time. I can't get to see you, Mark, in person as much as I'd like to, because you're in New York, I'm in California. And there's, and then that just, you continue across your network and it compounds the effect. And so thinking about events is just like a great way to see people, to nurture relationships, to potentially build new relationships. But in a way that feels like organic, that's relationship focused versus closing a deal focused. Like that's where I think events can just really shine.
One of the coolest things that I would just add to that is I wouldn't look at events, in isolation from obviously the bigger picture. We know that's not what you do with your clients, right? But you mentioned the podcast, and I'll just sort of tie the two together. For me, one of the coolest experiences is when I go to a conference and I'll present or I'll MC, and then I'll connect with somebody after, and they mention, I listened to your podcast, and I feel like I already know you, So I'd say the best way to have an effective experience at an event, right, is not to think of it in sort of an isolated context, right? It's to think about like, all right, how do I get my messaging out much earlier, right? And not everybody should have a podcast. I saw the other day, I know we were joking on our podcast, the dude with the sign, right, holding up his sign that says, who's listening to all these podcasts, right? And that's in the back of my mind. I don't think everyone should have a podcast, but if you have a newsletter, if you are being interviewed in local papers or you're on television, right, and you kind of think about how you can connect the dots between any media or any digital that you're doing in advance of an event, right, it becomes that much easier to like really personalize the content you deliver, any of the one-to-one interactions, and really take advantage of all the time and money, of course, right, that you're spending to be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, like, if we're thinking, okay, these are all the potential outcomes, which sound, we know them to be very valuable. Like, I think that they sound to be valuable for businesses thinking about brand credibility, recognition, like bringing new ideas, thought leadership, insight to the market, creating community, education, all of those things. Like, I think the next question that I think about and thinking through how our clients approach things, like, is it, when you're approaching events, is it a more is more outcome, or do you have to be at all of the events? Like, does it matter if you're at all of the events versus the right types of events, which is sort of what you and I have been talking about?
Yeah, I actually think there's value in sort of scarcity, right? I don't think everyone should be at every event all the time, right? And maybe from a company perspective, right, you want to have a presence, so you can send a person or two people without having massive platinum sponsorship where your logo and your companies are spread out across someone else's event the entire time. But I think for the most part, there's real value in, if you have a CEO who's a great speaker, right, he or she legitimately has content that can educate and enlighten, right? I wouldn't put that individual on stage, once a month or, once every other month. I would really hold out and think about like, what are the two best places in any given year, right? Because you want to create some demand, right? I also would just say, in our space, there are definitely more events now than ever before, right? I think, there are pros and cons that go along with that. We can get into it if you want, but I think there are only so many events that a financial advisor can go to in a given year. We've actually done research on it, right? And they kind of max out at 3 or 4. And I'm talking about your typical financial advisor, right? We all know that there are like those super users that legitimately will go to 25 to 40 conferences in a given year, right? Put them to the side, right? And if you think that a typical financial advisor out of the 270,000 financial advisors in the United States is only going to go to 3 or 4, one of them might be their custodians conference, probably will be, right? One of them could be their broker dealer conference, right? And probably would be if that's the model, right? The others are like, all right, I'm going to choose 2 third-party conferences in any given year, right? So if you're on the other end of it as a sponsor and you're figuring out where you want to be, you have to really stop and look and say, all right, what kind of community has this third-party event provider created, and what will they deliver that no one else can deliver anyway, right? I think we all get distracted by the quantity, right? And we don't necessarily always look at the quality. Anyone can say we have an event with 5,000 financial advisors, and then you show up and you're like, am I in the right place? Like, I feel like I'm lost, right? And I think unfortunately a lot of people have had that experience. I'm at the point where, can you meet people at that event that you couldn't meet anywhere else, right? And if they're the decision makers, right? If they're the ones who are influencing, whether it's purchasing, right, or they're influencing hiring, or if you're a custodian or a broker dealer and you're trying to find new recruits, and they're the ones who are really thinking about like, are we in a good place or would we be in a better place? You really want to make sure that you're at those decision maker events more than anything, because those people don't leave their offices, their teams, their clients, and their families for 3 or 4 days unless they're going someplace for a reason, right? And typically, the financial advisors tend to follow, right? So, my advice for anybody who's evaluating, the events that they should go to is really asking that question: are decision makers going to be there, right? And if they are they the people that I haven't been able to access or haven't accessed in a long time, right? And that's not an easy thing to do, but I think you can get those answers pretty quickly.
I think we should talk about the pros and cons of the number of events in this industry, because it can be really unwieldy. Like
Yeah.
we have this master conference spreadsheet that we keep that's like multiple tabs long, and on each tab there's like 40 or 50 per quarter, that we're actively tracking on behalf of our clients. It's overwhelming. I think that some of the pros, just to like start the thought around that, is it gives advisors of all different types, all different interests, all different locations, right? Like the ability to have optionality. So the ability to say, maybe I don't want to do an overnight, or maybe I don't want to get on a plane, but if there's something that's nearby that feels compelling to me, I'll show up, and otherwise I wouldn't have shown up. So like having options, I think for the advisor, who's the target audience of these events, I think options are good. I think that there are a lot of events that have popped up that are sort of hyper focused on specific topics. So like, I think that that's one of the pros of there being more events, is that you're getting, a lot of the events that cover big, broad topics like growth. But then there's some really, I know you and I have always been involved with Dan Siebert at Echelon Partners on the Deals and Dealmaker Summit, right? Like a hyper focused event on M&A. Snappy Kraken hosts the Jolt conference specifically on advisor marketing. So I think that's another one of the pros. And I'd love to hear yours. I think from a drawback perspective to me, and it's sort of like, it's relevant to the point that you just made, quality can suffer, right?
Oh yeah. We hear it all the time. And typically the sponsorships at a client are bought by somebody in a marketing department who doesn't necessarily attend, right? So what's interesting is if the CEO or someone in the leadership team attends, and the marketing person was told, oh, there are going to be 1 billion CEOs at this conference, and there are 3 people, right? And the kitchen staff, right? There's a massive disconnect, right? And I think events in general can get a bad rap, which is why I'm glad we're having this conversation. I'd say my take on this is, yes, options are good, but too many options are not, right? And I think, coming out of COVID, we're probably overscheduled and oversubscribed, right? We shouldn't have as many conferences, for our industry as we do right now. And I don't know that, everyone will agree with this, but it seems like there have been more and more sponsors, right? So product providers, service providers in our space who are now hosting their own conferences, right? And in some cases that can be really good. And maybe early on they started as client or user conferences, right? But they've ballooned, right? And they've become much more than that, right? I personally don't think that that's a good thing for our space, right? And obviously that'll come across as biased because I'm a third party, right? And while I don't compete with my clients, right, we do compete for calendars and attentions and all of that. I'll say this, I look at it almost like editorial content versus sponsored content, right? I think if we have too many product providers or service providers that are hosting conferences, the content's not objective, right? It tends to be about the event underwriter, right, or the organizer, first and foremost, right? Obviously, bring in sponsors and other thought leaders to level the conversation out. But if I own and operate a really large, let's call it, I don't want to get myself into trouble now, right? But a really large bottle manufacturing company. And I host a conference for 1,000 people, and there are 50 sponsors there. I'm going to prioritize my people and my brand, right, above all of my sponsors, right? It's just the reality of it. And I don't think it creates level or editorial like content, right? It can, but it's secondary. So, for me, I would love it if we had fewer events, period, right? Less competition for attention, and more of sort of a third party filter that allows somebody like, quite frankly, us having a media group, an editorial team with 25 plus individuals on it who have an unbiased view across the wealth management industry saying, this company is really interesting. This topic is really important. This person is somebody that we should be putting on a main stage, right? I wouldn't be doing, right, what I'm doing if I didn't really believe that that was the right way to produce events. So in the end, we know how time consuming it is to travel. We know how expensive it is to travel, to sponsor an event, to even ship some of the materials you need if you're a sponsor to an event. It's outrageous. That's the business we should be in, actually, Megan. But you really do have to ask, is this an objective event or is there an agenda, right? And if there is an agenda, right, sometimes as a sponsor of that event, you feel like you're maybe being forced to be there because if you're not, it just looks bad. So that being said, I think it's good to have options. I think it's bad to have too many options. And when you're a sponsor or an advisor and you're thinking about where you want to spend your time and how you're going to maximize your time, I would ask the question about, objectivity, like how objective is this event and how much is it advocating for one type of company or one particular company versus everything else that's really out there.
Yeah, I think that there's a dilutive impact, right? When you've got 300-400 events throughout the year and advisors can only go to so many. And I think from a vendor's perspective, if you had always hosted a user conference and that was really around like educating people on how to use your technology and your platform and also community building, like do you then also dilute the experience by opening it up to everybody? So I think that's interesting. But like, I want to talk a little bit about bias, and I'm always told to do like 20 or 30 minutes, and I really want to keep to that time frame, but then there's so much to talk about. So like, I'll try to get there, but like, from a bias perspective, like I do feel like there's a lot of conversations in the industry around paid, like if you're a sponsor, you also get a speaking slot. There are some conferences that are pretty well known in the industry that you're not going to get on the agenda, period. Like, doesn't matter how amazing you are, your thought leadership or insights are, your PR firm is, like, you're not going to get on the agenda if you're not a sponsor. So that to me like decreases objectivity. So when you're thinking through how you're building agendas for your events, Mark, like how do you balance that? Like I hear you are an incredible editorial team and the content that you bring that I've experienced is so rich. But I also know that there's the business side of it. So how do you bring that all together to keep that level of objectivity and not be biased by, well, I've got a sponsor who's paying $100,000 sponsorship fee, so of course they're going to get the keynote.
We could probably do a podcast on that, but then that would give a lot of my competitors, right, some of the secret sauce. So I'll just give sort of a quick overview on that one. The way I've always approached it and the way we approach it now with our events is we will always start by saying who are the 20 or so speakers we have to have on the agenda, right? Regardless of are they sponsors or not, right? Always start there. Always, right? Because that defines not only the content and the quality, right, of the content that you're creating, but it defines the community, right, that you're trying to create. So we always start there, right? Once you've done that, you have a pretty good sense for how many remaining spots there are, right, on an agenda, right? So you can look at your inventory and you can basically say, okay, it's limited, right? Because the entire agenda is not wide open for purchase, right? With that, could we or should we go to within each of the sort of respective swim lanes, right? The top 5 to 10 companies, right, that are associated with each. And that's what we do. Like, it's not out there where, we're just sending emails to 400 companies and saying, who wants to buy this speaking spot, right? We basically say, here's what we're trying to accomplish. This is our community. We think you have one of the leading voices in the spot, in the industry, but there are a limited number of positions to basically be on this panel, for example, or to have an opening keynote. If it works and you want to sponsor, great, right? If not, that's okay, right? There are other people that we can talk to, right? My sort of, when it comes to like product development, my strategy has always been, you can't always convince everybody to buy everything all the time, right? But you can lead with, almost like a lawyer would, an argument that this package and this opportunity is so valuable and compelling that even if I don't have the money, I can't deny, right, that I should be there, right? So that's sort of the long-winded way of saying editorial first, right? Limit the number of spots that are available and really limit the pool, right, of people that you want to talk to and you want to present that to. Just because we've seen some companies that have popped up, right? They've gotten a lot of money from private equity or venture capital, and they can buy a keynote, right? But if that company is here today and gone tomorrow, that is terrible, right, for your brand as an event organizer, right? So you kind of know in your mind's eye who you want, right? And in the best of cases, you're actually working with a sponsor who is paying to put somebody on the agenda that you might have said in a perfect world, I'm selecting this person independently, right? The last note that I'd make there, you asked how I spend a lot of my time on the event. That's actually where I spend most of my time, especially now. is, once we've generated interest, right, it's to say, how do we make sure that this group of people that we have, our clients and sponsors, are having a conversation that is cohesive, right? But beyond that is also impactful, right? So it's not like we're selling, this is a direct indexing panel, who wants it? In some cases, we're saying we're talking about the future of wealth management, right? And what are the 5 mega trends reshaping wealth management over the next 5 years? There are only a handful of people and companies that could legitimately be in that conversation, right? So how do we help make that conversation as articulate as possible and as impactful as possible? And truthfully, that's where I spend a very large amount of my time, because it's that important.
Yeah, I mean, we're good friends, so obviously I bring bias to this, but I also think this is objective. I think you do that masterfully, and I've been to so many events that do not have that cohesion, that strategic thinking, that narrative, the thought around community building. And it's important, like that's, to me, like that's the value that I'm seeking when I'm spending my time or my resources to be somewhere. So okay, 2 more things and then we'll wrap it up. I want to talk about how do you get, I want to talk about becoming a speaker and then the exhibit hall floor. So you mentioned that when you start planning for Wealth Management Edge, you've got this list of, like, I think you said 20 to 40 speakers that like have to be there, not at all related to any additional spots that sponsors could potentially, opt into. How, if I'm an executive, how do I get on that list?
That's a great question. I'll make it really simple, right? You have to have something to say, right? And I know that may seem ridiculous, right? But I've done plenty of interviews where if you just looked at the transcript, right, they're all the same, right? It doesn't matter what the title or the company is, right? They've been overly scripted in a lot of ways, right? And if they're not, they have the same set of talking points that are fed to them, right? So I do think if you're somebody who legitimately has something to say where your voice is your own, right? And more importantly, information that you're sharing, whether it's as a contributor, right, in magazines or on websites, or you're on CNBC or fill in the blank, right? If you're not overexposed and you're legitimately, like, we're a B2B business, right? And so you have to legitimately add value from a business perspective when you're presenting yourself as a thought leader, right? I was having a conversation with Michael Kitces this morning, actually, right? And we were talking about marketing, right? And one of the points that he made was how little a lot of advisory firms spend on marketing, right? It could be less than 3% of their total revenue, right? Even the really large companies too. And then if you look at what some of the largest RIAs are paying to essentially acquire firms, right? The math isn't there. They're paying 10 times as much to acquire a firm, right, as they would to acquire a client, right? If you really just did the math and reduced it to that. So I use that example because, like, that's a perfect way of saying, going beyond saying marketing is important, you need to do more of it, right? It's contextualizing it, and then what happens after that, right, is Michael or someone like him can give you a plan, right, for saying, all right, maybe I do need to go from 3% of revenue to 10% of revenue, right? So if you're somebody who can not only talk the talk, but can help you activate, right, then you are somebody who will absolutely be at the top of that list of the 20 to 30, 40 people that will get an invite to Wealth Management Edge. That is for sure.
So good. So good. So the last question, we've all been and walked the exhibit hall floors, right? And it's, booth, 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 booth. And how, like, as an exhibitor, what guidance would you give to the marketing team, like, to your point, that may have never been to this event before, and now they're tasked with, help us as a business show up in a way that's authentic to our brand and that's engaging and going to pull people into the booth and not overly cheesy, but also doesn't cost too much money. Like, it's a hard charge, right, to like show up as an exhibitor in a way that's successful. So, like, what guidance would you give to a marketing team that's planning for Edge?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, and nobody ever talks about it, right? And just before I answer that, one thing I would just sort of say to simplify or give a simpler answer to the question you asked before, right? How do you get on that list of top 20, top 30 speakers? For me, it's your content has to have intent, right? But more specifically, like business intent, right? Like, so if I'm listening to you, do I have a better idea of how to increase the value of my business, for example? And if it's there, boom, right? Because that provides ROI on any registration or ticket that we would sell to an event.
Mm.
Getting to the exhibit hall and the exhibitor, the sponsor experience there, that's really hard. And every company has their own personality, right? I am not one for like the boat show, we're going to raffle off a motorcycle or something like that, right? It can work, right? But it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? So for me, I would say you have to have a purpose, right? And a purpose isn't just putting out a bunch of pamphlets and, looking at badges, saying people's names and saying, come on over, right? Like that's just the lowest common denominator experience. I think you have to go into an event thinking about outcome oriented networking, right? So definitely make sure you get a list in advance, right, of who will be there. And even if you don't get the email addresses, right, look these people up on LinkedIn and present the opportunity to connect at the event, but with intent, right? I personally hate it when people are like, hey, I'm going to be in New York, let's get together. Like, what does that mean? Like, right? Just because the proximity is a little bit easier to physically see each other. Like, no, what do you want to talk about, right? And then that makes it easier for me to decide if we should get together. So if you're, thinking about what's your strategy, a lot of the pre-work, right, can pay off when you're on site and making sure that you're getting to the people that are the highest priority. The other thing I would say is don't just think of it as a booth where, people are just going to come by passively and express interest in you and your product and your company, right? You have to create that interest too. So one thing that I've seen people do effectively, we've done a little bit, is if you have a podcast or you're looking to create some sort of media, right, or content, and everybody should, right? And maybe I'll end on that, but definitely think of your booth as almost like a multimedia station or platform, right? So host a podcast at your booth, right? Create some buzz, right? And we've seen people that have done wine tastings and bourbon tastings. There's nothing wrong with that. Like definitely all that conventional stuff you can do, but like there's something about having a microphone, sitting next to somebody who's not part of your company, might be your top advisor, might be a top influencer, and people sort of gathering around just to listen and feel like, I'm participating, right, in something. I have access to something that a lot of other people do not have access to right now. And there's a purpose and there's an intent around the space that you have in that exhibit hall. So that would be sort of the one piece of advice I'd give to the companies that have the ability, right, to sort of do that type of thing.
So good. Okay, so I want to just wrap up. Maybe you and I can each give like one key takeaway or idea for the audience, and then we'll close it out. I think what I've heard, which is validating, and I love your perspective, is like, yes, there are absolutely, there is a place for events in your overall strategy, right? Like it has to be a component of your overall strategy. But to really get clear, like as an executive of a business, to get really clear on why, right? Like why you would participate in industry events. And then once you're clear on that why, fill out the framework for, all right, why am I doing this? Who do I want to be there for? What are the intended outcomes? And then use that information to filter into, okay, how am I going to participate? Is it as a speaker? Is it as a sponsor? Is it both, just an attendee? But like give yourself time to think through a framework, so that when you're applying budget towards events, there's real meaning and intention behind why you're there and what you're looking to get out of it. What would you say, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. It's like any other investment you would make in your business. Like if you were hiring a new person, right, you wouldn't just hire them because you're like, oh my God, I'm at capacity, I need another body in here, right? You would say, all right, maybe we're over capacity, but there's an opportunity here to grow the business. So I need to make an investment in fill in the blank, right? I would think about the event, business in the same way, right? If I need to tap into a market, right? If I see an opportunity somewhere and I don't have the ability to unlock, right, all of the potential independently, and events can play a very important role in that. But once you've identified the right neighborhood, right, that you want to be in, right, or the right talent pool, to stick with the analogy, you really do need to have a plan, right? So just like you wouldn't hire a new person without an onboarding plan, without a career path, right? You need that sort of framework and plan for what am I going to do leading up to the event, right? What am I hoping to accomplish while I'm there? And then what am I going to do after, right? And that was one of the points I just wanted to make when we were talking about how do you leverage your booth and we were talking about podcasts, right? One thing that really surprised me about Wealth Management Edge last year was how much content people were creating while they were there. It was attendees, it was sponsors, it was speakers, it was you, right? But it lasted for months, right? And it really changed the way I thought about what we did while we were on site, right? It made it less about that 3 to 4 day, see you next year, right, type of event approach, and much more about, this sort of omni-channel world that we're living in right now, right? So, for me, I mentioned before, I would never look at the events in isolation from anything else that I'm doing leading up to it, whether it's digital marketing, or business development. But I really would be thinking, how does that event create a pool of content? How does it feed the next, part of my marketing strategy, my business development strategy, and not just in the immediate follow-up with the 20 people I met there, right? But how does it help me amplify my voice, right? Leverage the fact that I was part of this gathering of industry experts and leaders, right? And really maximize the post-event awareness that I can create in a way that like I said, I was surprised how much of it followed us around at Wealth Management Edge last year for a good 2 or 3 months after. But I would encourage people to now go in with a plan, right? And think about, what do I want to accomplish while I'm here? And how do I take what I'm doing here and make sure that I have the ability to leverage it, right, for the 2 or 3 months after an event as well. So that halo is something that I didn't think about until I saw it all play out right in real time, but would encourage everybody to start thinking about now.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having this conversation with me. I think when we first discussed it, I was like, oh, no one talks about this. But it's a question, it's a big question on the minds of people across the industry. And so this was super fun. Thank you to everyone out there who is listening. I hope that this provided value. I know that I got a lot of value out of it. And if you want to follow up with either of us, you can find myself and Mark. So it's Megan Carpenter and Mark Bruno on LinkedIn. Just search for us. If you have any follow-up questions, we will be happy to engage. And who knows, maybe this will spin into even more content, because I feel like there's a lot more we could talk about. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you for having me, Megan. I appreciate it.